My son and daughter-in-law threw my wife and me out of the Brooklyn brownstone we had spent 35 years building. As they tossed our suitcases onto the front lawn, my daughter-in-law smirked and said, "You belong under a bridge, not in a house like this." My wife burst into tears. I didn't say a word. I calmly handed them an envelope and looked them straight in the eye. "Before I leave, you should open it." The moment they saw what was inside, every color drained from their faces. "I don't take it for granted that you're here. So tell me, where in the world are you watching this? Drop your city or country below. It means more than you know. Some elements of this story are fictional, added for storytelling and educational value. Any resemblance to actual names or locations is coincidental, but the lesson underneath it all, that's the part that matters. The morning light came through the front windows of my brownstone, the way it always did in July, slow and golden, sliding across the hardwood floors like it had all the time in the world. I was sitting in the wingback chair by the fireplace with my coffee. The same chair I'd sat in every morning for 4 years, watching Brooklyn wake up through the tall windows I'd paid to have restored when we moved in. I heard Julian's footsteps on the stairs before I saw him. Heavy, deliberate. The kind of steps a man takes when he's already decided something. He came into the room with Renata 2 steps behind him, her arms crossed the way she crossed them when she'd already won an argument in her head. Diane was on the sofa. Sophie sat beside her, picking at the hem of her sleeve. Nobody looked at me directly. That told me everything before a single word was spoken. "Dad." Julian stopped in the middle of the room. "We need to talk about the living situation." I wrapped both hands around my mug. The coffee was still hot. "All right," I said. "Talk." "This isn't working." He gestured around the room, my fireplace, my restored windows. "Renata and I have been discussing it for a while now. The house needs a different kind of energy. A fresh start." "A fresh start," I repeated. "You've got your routines, and we respect that." His jaw tightened. "But this is our home now, Dad. And honestly, you'd be happier somewhere else. Somewhere with people your own age. People who understand what you need." My chest tightened, like someone had reached in and made a fist around my heart. 22 years I'd run a logistics company through recessions and broken contracts and employees who stole from me. And I had learned one thing above everything else: the most dangerous moment is the one where you let them see your face crack. "Is that right?" I said. Not a question. "A wall?" Renata stepped forward then, and her mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Edward," she said. "Come on. You belong under a bridge, not in a brownstone like this." She laughed. A light, breezy little laugh, like she'd said something clever at a dinner party. Diane flinched on the sofa. Sophie pulled harder at her sleeve. I set my coffee mug down on the side table. Slowly. I looked at Julian first, my son, my only son, the boy I'd carried on my shoulders at Coney Island when he was 5 years old, and I watched him hold my gaze for exactly 2 seconds before he looked away. Then I looked at Renata. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I'd put the envelope there that morning before anyone else was awake, the way you lay out tools before a job, calmly, deliberately, without ceremony. I set it on the coffee table between us. "Before I go," I said, "you might want to read that. All of you." Julian's eyes dropped to the envelope. Something shifted in his face, not understanding, not yet just the first cold edge of it moving under his skin. I stood up. I straightened my jacket. I picked up my hat from the hook by the door, the old gray one Margaret said made me look like a retired detective, and I put it on. That's when I heard the feet on the stairs. Fast, small, thundering down from the second floor, the way only a 6-year-old can thunder. Connor hit the bottom step, and sprinted across the room and wrapped both arms around my leg, his face pressed into my thigh, and looked up at me with those wide brown eyes that had never once in 6 years looked at me with anything but complete and uncomplicated love. "Grandpa, where are you going?" The room went absolutely still. Diane stopped breathing. Sophie's hands went motionless in her lap. Even Renata's clever smile dissolved into something she didn't have a name for. Julian looked at his son, then at me, and for one terrible second, his eyes went wet and bright. Then he pressed his lips together hard and looked at the floor. I crouched down. My knees ached the way they always ached in the morning, but I got down to Connor's level, and I put both hands on his small shoulders. I've got some errands to run, buddy," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "But I'll see you soon. That's a promise." Connor's lower lip pushed out. "You'll come back for dinner." "Not tonight." I squeezed his shoulders once. "But soon. Okay." He grabbed me around the neck and held on for a moment that I felt in every bone in my body. Then he let go, and I stood up, and I walked to the front door of the house I had bought with 35 years of my own labor. And I opened it, and I stepped out into the July morning. I did not look back. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. I walked down the stone steps to the sidewalk. The Brooklyn air was warm and smelled like coffee from the place on the corner, and bus exhaust and cut grass from somewhere down the block. I got into my car. I sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel, looking at the red brick face of my Brownstone through the windshield. The window boxes Margaret had planted the brass numbers above the door that I'd polished myself every spring. Then I started the engine and pulled into traffic. The envelope was still on the coffee table, and inside that house someone was about to open it. None of what just happened means anything. Not the envelope, not Renata's laugh, not the way Julian looked at the floor when his son asked me where I was going, unless you know who I am and how I got to that house in the first place. So let me back up, all the way back. My name is Edward Calloway. I'm 70 years old. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where my father drove a cement truck and my mother worked the register at a hardware store. And the 4 of us, me, my parents, and my younger sister, Carol, lived on what they brought home every Friday in white envelopes with the tops torn open. We were not poor. I want to be fair about that. We ate every night. We had coats in winter. But we were the kind of family where the car breaking down was a crisis, not an inconvenience, and where nobody talked about college until a guidance counselor brought it up junior year, and my mother came home from the meeting and cried at the kitchen table not from happiness, but because she didn't know how it was going to work. I went to Penn State on a partial scholarship and 2 summer jobs, and I graduated with a degree in supply chain management and exactly $1,100 in my checking account. I drove to Philadelphia, got a job at a freight logistics company, moving paper around a warehouse, and I told myself I had 5 years to figure out what I was actually doing. I figured it out in 3. I started Callaway Freight Solutions out of a rented office in South Philadelphia with 2 trucks I leased, and 1 client I'd stolen fair and square from my former employer by doing better work at a lower margin. I was 31 years old, and I was terrified every single morning for the first 4 years. Terrified how, my old accountant asked me once years later over dinner, like the floor might not be there when I stepped out of bed. I told him. Like I'd built everything on sand and 1 bad quarter would wash it out. He laughed. That feeling ever go away? Not until I sold the company, I said. And even then it took about a week. What I built over the next 35 years was not glamorous. Freight logistics is not a dinner party conversation. Nobody's eyes light up when you tell them you optimized refrigerated transport corridors across the mid-Atlantic. But by the time I sold Callaway Freight at 65, we had 41 trucks, 212 employees contracts, with 4 grocery chains and a pharmaceutical distributor, and a sale price that made my accountant put his drink down very carefully and say, "Edward, sit down." What funded all of that in the lean years, in the years when payroll was tight, and I was choosing between paying my drivers and paying myself, was something nobody ever saw. For 6 years, from the time Julian was 12 until Sophie graduated high school, I worked 2 jobs. Days I ran the company. Evenings and Saturday mornings, I drove a delivery route for a regional restaurant supplier. Cash off the books, nothing glamorous about it. I'd get home at 1 in the morning smelling like diesel and industrial kitchen degreaser, and I'd eat whatever Margaret had left, covered with a plate in the refrigerator, and I'd sleep 4 hours and do it again. Margaret knew. She never said a word about it to the kids. Not once. I remember one Saturday morning, Julian must have been 14. He came downstairs early and found me at the kitchen table eating leftover pasta at 6:15 in the morning, still wearing my delivery jacket. "Dad, why are you up so early?" he asked, squinting his hair going in 4 directions. "Errands," I said. He grabbed a box of cereal from the cabinet, poured himself a bowl, standing at the counter, and shuffled back upstairs. He was 14. The world was not yet something that happened to him. It was just furniture. I watched him go and I thought, good. That's exactly right. You shouldn't have to know about this. That's the whole point. I built the company so my children would never have to drive a delivery route at midnight. So they would never sit at a kitchen table at 65, wondering if the floor was going to hold. That was the dream. Not the Brownstone, not the sale price, not the number my accountant said I should sit down to hear. The dream was simpler than all of that. I just wanted my kids to have a foundation that would hold. What I didn't understand, what took me 35 years and a July morning in Brooklyn to finally understand, was that a foundation you hand to someone isn't the same as a foundation they build themselves. Margaret understood it before I did. She tried to tell me in her quiet way more than once. "Edward," she said to me one evening when Julian was in his 20s, sitting at our kitchen table in the old house in Haddonfield, with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "You're not giving them a head start. You're giving them a reason not to start." I told her she was being too hard on them. I was wrong about that too, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you about my children, I need to tell you about Margaret. Because without her, none of the rest of it makes any sense. Margaret Callaway was the kind of woman who noticed everything and said half of it. She grew up in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, the daughter of a high school history teacher, and a woman who made the best pot roast in South Jersey, and ran the church bake sale with the organizational precision of a military operation. Margaret inherited both the attention to detail from her father, the ability to hold a room together from her mother. She was 24 when I met her at a freight industry conference in Atlantic City, where she was working registration, and I was there representing my former employer. I spilled coffee on the registration table within 40 seconds of meeting her. She handed me napkins without blinking and said, "You want a name tag, or do you prefer to remain anonymous?" I married her 11 months later. For 35 years, she kept the house raised, 3 children, managed every school registration and pediatrician appointment and parent-teacher conference that I missed, because I was on a call with a distributor in Cincinnati or driving a delivery route at midnight. She did all of it without complaint. What she gave me instead of complaints was clarity, usually delivered quietly, usually at the kitchen table, usually when I least wanted to hear it. Julian was our first. He was a sweet kid, genuinely curious and funny, and better at reading people than I ever gave him credit for. What he wasn't was hungry. Not in the way I'd been hungry at his age, And I understood why, because I had made sure he never had to be. When Julian was 28, he opened a bar in Hoboken with a college friend and $40,000 of his own savings and $200,000 of mine. I didn't ask him to pay it back. I told him I believed in him, which I did, and that this was an investment, which it wasn't. It was a gift dressed up as faith. 14 months later, the bar closed. The friend disappeared. Julian called me from a parking lot in Hoboken at 11 o'clock at night. His voice stretched thin with something that wasn't quite shame, but was standing right next to it. "I'm in trouble," he said. "I owe people money. Real money. I don't know what to do." "How much?" I asked. He told me. $180,000 across 3 creditors. My stomach dropped straight through the floor of my home office, but my voice came out level. "Don't call anyone else tonight," I said. "I'll handle it." "Dad." "Julian." I cut him off gently. "I'll handle it. Go home and sleep." I was at this bank when it opened the next morning. I transferred the funds, contacted the creditors through my attorney, and sent Julian a text that said, "It's handled. Move forward." He texted back, "Thank you, Dad. I'll pay you back every cent." He never did, and I never asked. And Margaret sat across from me at breakfast the next morning and watched me eat my eggs and finally said, "You know that wasn't the right thing to do." "He needed help," I said. "He needed consequences," she said. "There's a difference, Edward." I told her she was wrong. I ate my eggs. I was wrong. Diane was our second. She had Margaret's eye for detail and absolutely none of her follow-through, which is a painful combination. She enrolled in the University of Delaware at 18, dropped out second semester because the major didn't feel right. Re-enrolled at Rutgers 2 years later, dropped out again after 1 semester because the commute was too hard. Then enrolled at a community college in Morris County when she was 23 and lasted 6 weeks before she stopped going to classes without telling anyone. Each time I paid the tuition, each time I paid the housing, each time I sat across from her and asked, "What do you want to try next?" Because I had decided that patience was the same as love, and that eventually she would find her footing if I just kept the floor underneath her. "She needs to fall," Margaret told me after the 3rd time. "Not hard, just enough to know the ground is real." "She's our daughter," I said. "She's 31 years old," Margaret said, "and she has never once in her life felt the weight of a consequence." "Edward, that's not kindness. That's a cage." I told her Diane just needed more time. I was wrong about that too. Sophie was our youngest, and in some ways the most painful to watch, because she had real ability. She was sharp and quick and better with people than either of her siblings. At 30, I called in a favor from a business contact, a man I'd worked with for 20 years, and got her an interview at his company's marketing division. She got the job on her own merits. I just opened the door. She called me 3 months later on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice carefully casual, the way it got when she was about to tell me something she knew I wouldn't like. "Dad, I'm going to step back from the position." My hand tightened around the phone. "Step back." "It's just not the right culture fit," she said. "The management style is really toxic, and I think, Sophie." My voice came out sharper than I intended. "That job took me 20 years of relationship building to access for you." "I know, Dad. I'm sorry." A pause. "Can you maybe help me figure out what's next?" I helped her figure out what was next. I always helped them figure out what was next. And Margaret sat at the kitchen table that evening with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and her hands wrapped around a mug of tea and looked at me for a long moment. "One day," she said carefully, "you're going to stop being there, and they won't know how to stand up." I told her I would always be there. She nodded slowly. She knew something I didn't. It was a Tuesday in October, 2 years after we moved into the Brownstone. I remember the exact moment because I'd just poured my second cup of coffee and was standing at the kitchen counter reading the logistics section of the Wall Street Journal out of habit. I hadn't owned a company in 5 years, but old habits are the last things to go when I heard it. Not a crash, not a scream. Just a sound like something heavy and soft landing wrong, followed by a single sharp cry that cut off too fast, the way pain cuts off sound when it's serious. I was up the stairs in seconds. Margaret was at the bottom of the staircase, not the bottom, but 3 steps from it, crumpled against the wall, with her left leg bent at an angle that made my blood go cold from my scalp to my feet. "Margaret?" I was on my knees beside her before I finished saying her name. "Margaret, don't move. Talk to me." Her face was white. Not pale white, the color of someone whose body has just absorbed something enormous and is still deciding what to do with it. She grabbed my forearm with both hands, and her grip was so tight, her knuckles went the same color as her face. My leg," she said. Her voice came out thin and very controlled, which was more frightening than if she'd been screaming. "Edward, something's wrong with my leg." I called 911. I sat on that staircase and held her hand and talked to her about nothing: the weather, the coffee I'd left on the counter, the neighbor's dog that barked every morning at 7, anything to keep her eyes on my face and her mind off the angle of her leg. The ambulance took 11 minutes. I counted every one of them. In the emergency room, while they were taking her back for imaging, a nurse asked me how it happened. "She fell on the staircase," I said. "The handrail on the left side." "Was it loose?" My chest caved in. "Yes," I said. "I'd noticed it about 2 weeks ago. I kept meaning to fix it." The nurse wrote something down on her clipboard. She didn't look up. She didn't have to. I sat in that waiting room for 4 hours with that sentence sitting on my sternum like a stone. I'd noticed it. 2 weeks ago. I kept meaning to fix it. I called Julian at 11:15. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice loose and unhurried, and I could hear wind in the background. He was outside somewhere. "Julian, your mother's been taken to the hospital. She had a fall at the house. She's in imaging right now, and I'll know more soon, but I needed to let you know." There was a pause. "Is she okay?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Okay." Another pause. "I'm actually in the middle of something right now, Dad. I'll head over after what he didn't specify." Diane arrived 40 minutes later, her coat inside out, her eyes red from crying in the car. Sophie came 20 minutes after that, slightly breathless, grabbing my arm in the waiting room doorway. "Dad, how is she? What happened? Is she going to be okay?" "We're waiting," I said. Julian walked through the emergency room doors 4 hours and 18 minutes after I called him. Margaret was out of surgery. She was in recovery. The orthopedic surgeon had already come out to brief me. Julian strolled in, still wearing his golf shirt sunburned across the back of his neck, and looked around the waiting room with the expression of a man who has arrived at a party after most of the guests have left. "How is she?" he asked. Something moved through me that I chose very deliberately not to act on. "She's out of surgery," I said. "The surgeon says she'll recover, but there's going to be significant rehabilitation. Her mobility is going to be limited." Julian nodded slowly. "Man," he said. "That's rough. That's rough." I looked at my son standing there with his golf tan and his unhurried posture, and I thought about the $1,100 in my checking account at 22, about the delivery routes at midnight, about the handrail I hadn't fixed, about Margaret's grip on my forearm on the staircase. I didn't say a word of that. I turned back toward the corridor where Margaret's room was. "She's asking for you," I told him. Which was true. Margaret came home 2 weeks later. I'd already had a contractor and new handrails on every staircase, grip bars in both bathrooms, a ramp for the back entrance. I painted over the new installations myself because Margaret liked the walls a specific shade of warm white, and I knew which brand she used. One evening, about a week after she was home, I was reorganizing a cabinet in our bedroom to make room for her therapy equipment when I found a small wooden box pushed to the back of the top shelf. I opened it expecting cufflinks or old photographs. Inside was a folded receipt from a jewelry reseller in Philadelphia. The date was from 14 years ago. The item described was a gold band with a quarter-carat diamond solitaire, and in the margin in Margaret's handwriting, 2 words, "Kids' tuition." She had sold her wedding ring. 14 years ago, when the company was struggling, she had quietly sold her wedding ring and used the money to cover Julian's tuition payment. I stood at that cabinet for a long time. The receipt shook slightly in my hands. Not from age, from me. I went downstairs. Margaret was in the living room with her leg elevated reading. She looked up when I came in. I held up the receipt. She looked at it. Her expression didn't change much. Just a small softening around the eyes, like a door opening a crack. "Edward," she said gently, "why didn't you tell me?" My voice came out rougher than I intended. "Because you would have found another way to fix it," she said. "And you had enough to carry." I went to the jewelry store the next week and bought her a new ring. She wore it every day without making a fuss about it the way she did everything. But some things you can't replace. Some things you just carry. Julian called on a Sunday evening in November, about 3 weeks after Margaret came home from the hospital. I was in the living room reading when the phone rang. Margaret was upstairs doing her physical therapy exercises 20 minutes every evening, the same routine the rehab center had given her, which she followed with the same quiet discipline she brought to everything. I could hear the faint sound of her moving overhead, slow and careful. "Dad," Julian said when I picked up. "Renata and I have been talking. We think you shouldn't be handling all of this alone. Mom's recovery, the house, everything." He paused. "We want to move in, just for a while, to help out." I looked up at the ceiling toward the sound of Margaret moving carefully across the bedroom floor above me. "Julian," I said slowly, "you don't have to do that." "We want to," he said, and his voice was warm, genuinely warm, the way it used to sound when he was young and hadn't yet learned to want things from me. "You've always been there for us, Dad. Let us be there for you." I said yes. "I want you to understand that clearly I opened that door myself." I said yes because I was 67 years old, and my wife moved through our house like she was learning it again from the beginning, and I had been waking up at 3 in the morning, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. I said yes because I was lonely in a way I didn't have words for yet. And Julian's voice on the phone that Sunday sounded like the Julian I used to know, the one I'd been waiting to show back up for 20 years. They moved in the first weekend of December. Julian, Renata, and Connor, who was 4 years old, and ran at full speed into every room he entered, like he was testing whether the walls would hold. The first week, I carried him on my shoulders through the house, showing him which rooms were which, and he grabbed my ears with both hands for balance and laughed so hard he got the hiccups. For 6 months, it was genuinely good. There was noise in the house again. There were crayon drawings on the kitchen table and someone else's coffee cup always in the wrong place in the dish rack, and Connor's sneakers by the front door always untied, always exactly where someone would trip over them. Margaret started coming downstairs for dinner every night. She laughed more. Her physical therapist told me her recovery was ahead of schedule. Then Diane called in February, wanting to know if she could stay for a few weeks, while she figured out her next move. Then Sophie in April with the same request, slightly different wording. By May, all three of my children were living in my house with their combined total of 0 stable incomes and 1 husband and 1 grandson, and I was covering every bill, every grocery run, every streaming subscription, every tank of gas in Julian's Jeep. The changes started the way all slow things start. So gradually, I kept thinking I was imagining it. The living room furniture got rearranged one weekend while I was out. I came home and the wingback chair I'd sat in every morning for 4 years was against the far wall where the light didn't reach it, replaced in the center of the room by a low leather sectional Renata had ordered online. Better flow, she told me when I asked about it. The old arrangement was really blocking the energy of the space. I moved my chair back the next morning. It was back against the wall by afternoon. Nobody mentioned it. Then one Saturday I came into the kitchen and found Renata sitting at the island with a woman I didn't recognize, fabric swatches spread across the counter, paint chips fanned out beside them like a hand of cards. "Oh," the woman said, looking up at me with bright professional interest. "You must be Julian's father. It's so wonderful that you get to stay here with the family." Stay here. With the family. In my house. That I bought. My jaw tightened. I looked at Renata. Renata smiled at me the way you smile at someone when you want them to understand they are interrupting. "Edward, we're just finishing up in here. Do you mind giving us another 20 minutes? "Of course," I said. The words came out of my mouth before I decided to say them. That was the thing I didn't understand until much later. By the time you notice yourself apologizing for existing in your own home, you've already been doing it for months. I took my coffee out to the front stoop and sat on the top step and watched a woman walk her dog past the Brownstone and thought about the morning I'd signed the closing documents on this building, the way my hand had trembled slightly on the pen. Not from nerves, but from the specific emotion of a man who has worked for something so long that arriving feels unreal. That was the moment I should have walked back inside and said something. I didn't. I finished my coffee. I went back in through the side door so I wouldn't disturb Renata and the designer. And that was how it went. Every time saying something would have made me the difficult one, so I didn't. Every time I told myself it was just furniture, just paint chips, just 20 minutes in a kitchen. And every time I handed over another small piece without naming what I was doing. Margaret watched all of it from her chair by the window with her reading glasses and her tea and her expression that said she understood exactly what was happening and was waiting for me to catch up. "You know what this reminds me of?" she said one evening when the house had gone quiet. "What?" I asked. "The handrail," she said. I didn't answer her. But my chest tightened the same way it had in that hospital waiting room. And we both knew I understood exactly what she meant. It was a Thursday in March. I'd gone to bed around 10, but woke up at midnight the way I'd been waking up since Margaret's accident, suddenly completely, with no transitional fogginess, just eyes open, and the ceiling of my bedroom and the specific quality of silence that tells you a house is not as quiet as it sounds. I was thirsty. That was all. I put on my slippers and my robe and went downstairs for a glass of water. The kitchen light was off. The hallway light was off. The only light in the downstairs came from under the dining room door. A warm amber sliver that meant the lamp in the corner was on the one Julian had moved there from my study without asking, the one that used to sit beside my desk. I was 3 steps from the kitchen when I heard Julian's voice through the door. I stopped. Not because there was anything alarming in his voice, there wasn't. It was calm, unhurried, the voice of a man having a comfortable conversation about comfortable things. That was what stopped me. The comfort of it. The third floor would work perfectly, Renata was saying. Your parents don't use it anyway. Your dad barely leaves the first floor these days. Mom goes up to the bedroom, Julian said. Right, but that's it. The third floor has been sitting empty for 8 months. A pause. I heard the soft sound of a wine glass being set down. My parents need somewhere, Julian. They closed on the Parsippany house last week. They're looking at rentals right now, and the prices are insane. I know. Julian's voice was careful. But we'd need to talk to Dad about it. How would we? Renata's voice was not unkind, just practical. The voice of someone doing arithmetic. He's happy here, Julian. He's comfortable. But long term. Another pause, lighter, like she was choosing words that had already been chosen. There are some really beautiful communities in Brooklyn. Places where he'd have people his own age. Activities. Medical staff on site. The kitchen was very dark. I stood in it and did not move, and did not breathe more than I had to. Yeah, Julian said. And then after a silence that lasted long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat, maybe in a year or two, I stood in that dark kitchen at 68 years old, and I felt something move through me that I had no category for. It wasn't rage, I want to be precise about that, because rage would have been simpler. Rage would have sent me through that door and into that conversation and out the other side in 15 minutes. What I felt was not rage, it was clarity. The cleanest, coldest, most complete feeling I have ever had in my life, like someone had opened a window in a room I'd been fumbling around in for 3 years. Like a light coming on. Because standing in that kitchen, I understood something I had been refusing to understand since Margaret fell on that staircase. My son was not going to become a different man. I had been waiting for that, waiting for the version of Julian I had been telling myself existed underneath the one I could see. The one who had made that toast at his graduation dinner, who had grabbed my hand in the hospital waiting room when Connor was born, and said, Dad, I'm a father, I don't know what I'm doing, that version. I had been waiting for him to come back. He wasn't coming back. The man in the dining room, comfortable with his wine, planning which facility to put his father in, while his father stood 12 feet away in the dark, that was Julian. That was the finished version. And I had built him piece by piece, payment by payment, every time I had fixed something he should have fixed himself. I picked up my glass of water. I walked back upstairs. I did not make a sound on the staircase. Not because I was trying to be stealthy, but because somewhere in those 3 minutes in the dark kitchen, I had become very calm in a way I hadn't been calm in years. The kind of calm that isn't peace exactly. The kind that comes after a decision. I got into bed. Margaret stirred. Edward. Her voice was soft, still half in sleep. You okay? I looked up at the ceiling in the dark. My heart was beating steadily. My hands were completely still. I'm going to make a phone call tomorrow morning, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, to who? A lawyer, I said. Someone who doesn't know our kids. Margaret reached across the bed and put her hand over mine. She didn't ask me anything else. She didn't need to. After 40 years, she understood the difference between a man who was upset and a man who had made up his mind. She squeezed my hand once. Then she turned over and went back to sleep. I lay there until 4 in the morning, looking at the ceiling, thinking about nothing in particular. Thinking about everything. When the alarm went off at 7, I was already dressed. Her name was Patricia Holt, and she came recommended by my old accountant, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had handled my books for 22 years and had never once in that time told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was something different. She does estate and elder law, Gerald told me on the phone that morning. No connection to your family. She's never met Julian, never met Renata. That matters for what you're describing. It mattered more than I knew at the time. Patricia's office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Brooklyn, the kind of office that tells you immediately the person inside it does not need to impress you. Good furniture, no artwork chosen for effect. A window that looked out over the rooftops toward the harbor. She was in her late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the kind of steady, unhurried attention that costs a lot per hour and is worth every cent. I sat down across from her and told her everything. The whole story from the November phone call to the dining room conversation 3 nights ago. I talked for 25 minutes without stopping. She took notes in a legal pad with a pen she kept clicking open and closed, which I came to understand was how she thought. When I finished, she set the pen down. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "before we talk about options, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take your time with it." She folded her hands on the desk. "What do you actually want?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. I sat there in Patricia Holt's office with the harbor visible through the window behind her, and I could not answer that question. 3 years of being managed, of saying fine, and of course, and I don't mind, and I had stopped generating wants of my own. I had become a man who reacted to other people's plans for him. Patricia let the silence sit. She was good at that. Then she asked a different question. "If the house were gone tomorrow, just gone, what would you miss?" I thought about it honestly. The wingback chair Renata had moved to the wall, the study that was now a playroom for Connor. The paintings Margaret had chosen that had come down one by one and gone into storage. The kitchen where a designer had told me it was nice that I got to stay with the family. "Nothing," I said. And I heard myself say it, and I knew it was true. There's nothing in that building I want. Everything I actually care about either comes with me, or it's already gone. Patricia nodded slowly. "Then let's talk about what your options are." She laid them out clearly, the way a good lawyer does, not with drama, just with facts. In the state of New York, a property owner has the absolute right to require occupants without a lease agreement to vacate with proper written notice. Since Julian and the others had no lease, no rental agreement, and had never paid rent, they were legally classified as licensees, guests, not tenants. A 30-day written notice, properly documented and delivered, was sufficient to require them to leave. "Separately," she said, "any financial support you're providing, allowances, credit cards, bill payments, you can terminate immediately. There's no legal obligation to continue voluntary financial support to adult children." "And the will, I asked. "Your will is entirely yours to update at any time for any reason, as long as you're of sound mind, which you clearly are." She picked up her pen again. "No one can contest a will simply because they expected to inherit. They'd need to prove undue influence or incapacity. Neither applies here." I nodded. My hands were very still on my knees. "When can we start?" I asked. She almost smiled. "We already have?" I drove home, and that evening I sat with Margaret in our bedroom with the door closed and told her everything Patricia had said. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was how she listened when something was important. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she reached across and took both of my hands in hers and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years. "Edward," she said, "do it. I've been watching this for months. Do what you need to do. I am completely with you." Her grip on my hands was stronger than I expected, given everything her left side had been through. It steadied me in a way I hadn't realized I needed until that moment. She signed the power of attorney documents the next morning, before Julian and Renata were awake. I called James Wheeler that afternoon. James had been my friend since we were both 26 and working for the same freight company in Philadelphia, and in 40 years, he had never once given me advice I didn't ask for. I told him what I was doing in about 4 sentences. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tell me when you need me there." "I'll send you the date," I said. "I'll be there," he said. That was the entire conversation. For the next 8 weeks, I had breakfast with Julian every morning. I held Connor on my lap in the living room. I said good morning to Renata in the hallway. I sat at the dinner table with my 3 children and talked about the weather and the Mets and whether the bodega on the corner made better coffee than the place on Atlantic Avenue. And every Tuesday, I went to Patricia's office and signed something. The envelope was ready on a Monday morning in late June. Patricia handed it to me across her desk in a plain manila envelope sealed with nothing written on the outside. "You know what to do with it," she said. "I know exactly what to do with it," I said. "Before I tell you what Renata found inside that envelope and what it did to every person in that room, comment, 'I'm here, right now, so I know you're still with me.' Because what happened next inside my house is something I never fully expected myself. Note parts of this story include fictional elements for narrative purposes. No judgment if you'd rather stop here, but if you're staying, buckle up. Now I need to go back to that Tuesday morning in July, because when I walked you through it the first time I left something out. I left out what happened after the door closed behind me. I know what happened because Diane told me 2 weeks later, sitting across from me at a coffee shop on Flatbush Avenue with both hands wrapped around her mug and her eyes red from crying on and off for most of the conversation. She told me in the careful, halting way of someone who is confessing and reconstructing at the same time. The envelope sat on the coffee table for about 40 seconds after I left. Julian stood looking at it. The way you look at a bill you already know is too high. Like looking long enough might change the number. Renata crossed the room, picked it up, and tore it open before he could say anything. "That's how she was," Diane told me, her voice catching. "She always handled everything. Julian just let her." Renata unfolded the 2 documents inside and read them standing up. Diane said her face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 10 seconds. Confusion first, then focus, then something that Diane described as the specific look of a person doing very fast math and not liking the answer. Then Renata read them again, more slowly. "What is it?" Julian asked. Renata set the papers down on the coffee table and turned around and looked at her husband. "Julian," she said, and her voice was completely flat, the way voices get when emotion has been temporarily suspended by shock. "Your father just terminated every account he's been paying for us, every card, every transfer, all of it effective today." Julian stared at her. "What? There's also a legal notice." Renata's voice stayed flat, the flatness of someone holding themselves very carefully together. "From an attorney named Patricia Holt. It says we have 30 days to vacate the property." She paused. "All of us." The room, according to Diane, went completely and utterly still. Sophie made a sound that wasn't quite a word, more like the sound a person makes when they've stepped off a curb they didn't see. Diane said her own hands started shaking in her lap, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to stop them. Then Renata turned around and looked at the sofa where Frank and Sylvia Draper had been sitting through all of this, her parents who had driven up from New Jersey 3 days earlier and had been staying in the guest room on the 3rd floor, the same floor they believed would soon be theirs permanently. They had sold their house in Parsippany 6 weeks ago, and had been expecting to move their furniture in August. This visit was meant to be the last look before the move. Frank Draper was 71 years old. He had the build of a man who had worked with his hands most of his life, and the face of a man who did not rattle easily. He was rattled now. He looked at his daughter. His voice came out low and careful. "Renata, what is this?" "Dad." Renata started. "We closed on the house," Frank said. His voice rose slightly on the last word, not in anger, but in the way a voice rises when a fact has suddenly become unbearable. "Renata, we closed on the Parsippany house. We have nowhere to go." Renata's composure cracked, then not all at once, but the way a windshield cracks from a single point outward. "I didn't know he was going to do this," she said. "I didn't know." "How long has this attorney been involved?" Frank cut her off. Renata pressed her lips together. She didn't answer. Sylvia Draper, who had not said a word, reached over and took her husband's hand. Her face had gone the gray-white color of someone absorbing news that cannot be unabsorbed. Julian picked up the documents from the coffee table. He read them. He read them again. Then he looked up at Renata, and his voice, when it came out, was very quiet and very specific. "Renata," he said, "did you know something like this was coming?" "Of course not," she said. "Because Patricia Holt sent a letter to this address 3 weeks ago," Julian said. "I signed for it. I thought it was—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I thought it was Dad being dramatic." The room erupted. Diane was crying openly now, her hands no longer pretending to be still. Sophie had both palms pressed against her face. Frank Draper stood up from the sofa and walked to the window and stood with his back to the room. Sylvia kept hold of his hand, half rising from the sofa to follow him. Renata turned on Julian, her voice climbing. "You signed for a letter from an attorney, and you didn't tell me—" "I didn't think it was real," Julian said. His voice broke slightly on the last word. The crack of a man who has just understood, far too late, the precise cost of not taking something seriously. "I thought he'd calm down. I thought I'd go talk to him and it would get sorted." "Did you go talk to him?" Julian's throat moved. He looked at the documents in his hand. "No," he said. "I wasn't there for any of it. I was sitting in my car on a side street 2 blocks away, watching the minutes on my dashboard clock move toward 9. My coffee was going cold in the cup holder. My phone was face down on the passenger seat. At 8:59, I picked it up and made one call. At 9 o'clock, exactly every card linked to my accounts that I had been paying on behalf of my children stopped working, simultaneously. In the same moment that 2 blocks away, Julian was standing in my living room holding documents he had chosen not to read for 3 weeks. I set the phone down. I looked out through the windshield at the Brooklyn street in front of me. A woman walked past with a stroller. A man in a delivery uniform came out of the building on the corner. I started the car. I drove for about 40 minutes without a destination. That sounds more dramatic than it was. I wasn't falling apart. I wasn't gripping the wheel or pulling over to breathe, or any of the things people do in movies when their lives shift. I was just driving the way I used to drive the delivery route at midnight, when I needed my hands to be doing something while my head caught up with the rest of me. I ended up on the BQE heading north, then cut back through Williamsburg, then found myself parked in a private lot near the bridge that I'd used sometimes when I came to this part of Brooklyn for meetings years ago. The attendant recognized me. I'd tipped him well twice, which in New York is the entire basis of a relationship, and waved me into a spot without asking questions. I turned off the engine. My phone was face down on the passenger seat. I left it there. I sat in that car and watched the Williamsburg Bridge through the windshield, the way the cables caught the morning light, and I thought about the 35 years that had produced the envelope I'd left on that coffee table. I thought about the delivery routes, about the night Julian called from the Hoboken parking lot, about Margaret's grip on the power of attorney pen, steady and sure, like she'd been waiting to sign something for a long time. I wasn't sad. That surprised me a little. I had expected to feel something heavier, some grief for the version of this that should have been the version where none of this was necessary. But what I actually felt sitting in that parking lot with the bridge cables catching the light was something closer to relief. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying something a long way and has finally set it down. My phone buzzed. Then again. Then 3 times in quick succession. I picked it up. Diane, Sophie, Renata, 3 missed calls in 4 minutes. Then a text from Julian. Not a call, a text. I looked at it for a long moment before I opened it. It read, "Hey Dad, what's the Wi-Fi password for the basement router?" I stared at that message for what felt like a full minute. When I'd called the bank that morning, I had also changed the network passwords on both routers, the main one and the basement one, the same way I'd changed everything else that was mine to change. Julian had apparently discovered this and decided that the most pressing issue of the morning was getting back online. My son had just watched his wife read a legal notice requiring him to vacate our family home within 30 days, had just learned that every financial account his father had been maintaining for him had been terminated effective that morning, and his first communication to me was a text message asking for a Wi-Fi password. I turned the phone face down again. I did not reply. The afternoon passed slowly. I drove to a diner on Bedford Avenue and ate a turkey club sandwich at the counter and drank 2 cups of coffee and read the Post that someone had left on the stool next to me. The waitress refilled my cup without being asked, which is the highest form of hospitality in New York. By evening, I was back in the parking lot near the bridge. I had no plan for where to sleep. I had more than enough money for a hotel. I could have called the front desk at the Brooklyn Marriott and had a room in 11 minutes. But there was something in me that evening that didn't want a hotel room. Didn't want the bright lighting and the key card and the minibar and the anonymity of it. I wanted to sit with what I'd done without the distraction of comfort. So I stayed in the car. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. Margaret. I picked up immediately. "Are you okay?" Her voice was warm and careful, the voice she used when she already knew the answer wasn't simple. "I will be," I said. A pause. "Do you need me to come find you?" I almost laughed at that Margaret who needed a cane and a handrail, and 20 minutes to get down 2 flights of stairs offering to come find me. "No," I said. "I'm fine. I just needed the evening." "Come home when you're ready," she said. "I'll leave the light on." I sat with that for a while after we hung up. At 8:30, someone knocked on my driver's side window. I startled not badly, just the standard jolt of a man who has been inside his own head for several hours, and turned to find a woman about my age, maybe a few years older, standing on the sidewalk in a quilted vest and orthopedic walking shoes, holding a paper bag from the Vietnamese place on Grand Street. Her name was Dorothy Patterson. She lived 4 houses down from my brownstone had for 31 years, and we had established over 4 years of neighborly proximity, the kind of relationship built on wave acknowledgments and the occasional comment about alternate side parking. She knocked again, more gently this time. I rolled down the window. "Mr. Calloway," she said, not unkindly. "I saw your car here when I went to pick up dinner. Have you eaten? I thought about the turkey club at the diner." That had been 6 hours ago. "Not recently," I said. She held up the paper bag. "I always order too much." It's a personal failing. She tilted her head toward a bench at the edge of the lot. There's a perfectly good bench right there. We sat on that bench in the warm July evening and ate pho from paper containers with plastic spoons because I didn't have chopsticks, and she hadn't thought to ask for them. Mrs. Patterson talked about her son in Portland and a disagreement she was having with her co-op board about the roof terrace, and a book she was reading about the history of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. She didn't ask me why I was sitting alone in a parking lot at 8:30 in the evening. She just talked steadily and pleasantly, the way certain people talk when they understand that what another person needs is not questions, but the simple sound of human company. When the food was gone, she gathered the containers back into the bag, stood up, and said, "Good night, Mr. Calloway. I hope tomorrow is a better day." "Thank you, Dorothy," I said. It was the first time I'd used her first name in 4 years. She walked away down the sidewalk toward our street. I watched her go. That bowl of pho on a bench in a parking lot near the Williamsburg Bridge was the best meal I ate all summer. I've thought about why, and I think it's because it was given without arithmetic. Dorothy Patterson brought me dinner because I looked like I hadn't eaten, and it was the decent thing to do. No calculation, no angle, just a woman with an extra order of pho and the good sense to not ask too many questions. I sat on that bench until 10 o'clock. Then I got back in my car, reclined the seat, and slept better than I had in months. James Wheeler sent me a screenshot at 7:19 the next morning. I was still in the parking lot, the seat halfway reclined, watching the early light hit the cables of the Williamsburg Bridge through the windshield. My back was stiff in the specific way that reminds a 70-year-old man that car seats are not designed for sleeping, and I had been awake for about 20 minutes, thinking about nothing in particular and finding it very peaceful. The screenshot was from Renata's Instagram. I didn't follow her. I had never had an Instagram account, a fact that had apparently been a source of quiet exasperation for Renata over the years. But James did in the distant observational way that men of a certain age follow people they've been warned to keep an eye on. The photo was of my living room. My fireplace, my restored windows, the low leather sectional that had replaced my wingback chair. The morning light was beautiful in it. I'll admit Renata had an eye for composition, whatever else I thought of her. The caption read, "Fresh start, new energy." There was a small sun emoji at the end. I looked at the photo for approximately 3 seconds. Then I texted James back, "Thank you," and put the phone in my pocket. I drove to a coffee shop on Bedford Avenue, used the bathroom, bought a large black coffee and a everything bagel, and sat at a table by the window for an hour. At 9 o'clock, I called Patricia. Renata posted a photo of the living room on social media, I told her. Captioned it, "Fresh start." A brief pause. I could hear Patricia clicking her pen. "Noted," she said. "Does it change anything for you?" "No," I said. "I just thought you should know the temperature in there." "The temperature in there," Patricia said, "is irrelevant to the legal process. The clock is running. 30 days from delivery of notice." Another click. "Is there anything else?" "One more thing," I said. "I need to go back to the house today. There are some personal items I need to retrieve, and I want to do it while they're out." "Do you know their schedule?" "Connor called me yesterday evening," I said. Connor had called from Julian's phone at 7, ostensibly, to tell me about a Lego set he'd built. Actually, I suspected because someone in that house had gotten to the point of needing to hear my voice and was too proud to make the call themselves. During the conversation, he had mentioned with the complete informational transparency of a 6-year-old that Daddy was taking everybody to the pizza place and the trampoline park tomorrow. "Or they'll be out by noon," I told Patricia. "Back by 5 at the earliest. As the property owner, you have every right to enter your own home at any time," Patricia said. "But take someone with you. Don't go alone." I called James. He met me at the Brownstone at 1 o'clock with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Atlantic Avenue, and the expression of a man who has been waiting to be useful for several weeks. I let us in with my key. The house had the specific quality of emptiness that comes when people have left in a hurry. Connor's cereal bowl still on the kitchen counter, unwashed. A jacket of Diane's over the back of a chair. The TV in the living room had been left on, showing a home improvement show on low volume. I went through the house methodically. My study now, Connor's playroom, the walls painted a bright yellow I would never have chosen, and retrieved the box of documents I kept in the closet. The bedroom for the personal items Margaret had asked me to bring her. The storage room on the 3rd floor for 3 boxes of photographs that had been moved there when Renata redecorated. James waited in the kitchen and drank his coffee and didn't offer to help unless I asked, which is one of the things that has made him worth knowing for 40 years. I was coming out of the storage room with the last box when I noticed the drawer in the built-in shelving unit in the hallway, the one that had been my catch-all for years, spare keys and old mail and the assorted debris of a household. It was slightly open. I set the box down and pulled the drawer all the way out. At the back, pushed behind a tangle of phone chargers and rubber bands, was a phone in a pink case. Not mine. Not Margaret's. I picked it up. It was Renata's. An older model, I recognized it as the one she'd replaced about 8 months ago. I assumed she'd lost it. Apparently, she'd left it here. I pressed the home button, not expecting it to respond. The screen lit up. The battery was at 11%. It had been slowly draining in that drawer for months. The camera roll opened to the last photo taken. It was a picture of the deed to my brownstone. I scrolled back. Slowly at first, then faster as I understood what I was looking at. Photographs, hundreds of them, organized into folders: living room, kitchen, study, master bedroom, 3rd floor. Each folder contained systematic, methodical photographs, furniture, artwork, decorative objects, and in a separate folder labeled Documents, photographs of every piece of mail that had sat on my kitchen counter over the course of 2 years. Bank statements, investment summaries, property tax notices, insurance renewals. She had been cataloging my assets, systematically, for months before she ever suggested moving in. I stood in that hallway for a long moment with Renata's phone in my hand and my heart doing something complicated in my chest. Not quite rage, not quite grief. Something that sits between the two and has no clean name. Then I walked down to the kitchen. James looked up from his coffee. He read my face immediately. "What did you find?" he asked. I set the phone on the counter between us. He looked at it. He looked at me. "Patricia," he said. "Patricia." I agreed. I called her from the kitchen while James finished his coffee. She told me to bring the phone directly to her office, photograph nothing myself, touch as little as possible. As the property owner with the phone found on my premises, the legal standing was clear. Does this change anything? I asked her the same question she'd asked me about the Instagram post that morning. "It confirms what we already knew," she said. "And it means that if they try to claim any of this was impromptu or emotional on your part, we have a very clear picture of what was being planned and by whom and for how long." I looked around my kitchen one last time. The unwashed bowl on the counter, the jacket on the chair, the home improvement show murmuring from the living room. I picked up my boxes. James held the door. We locked it behind us with the new keys Patricia had arranged. A locksmith had come that afternoon while the family was at the trampoline park, a fact I had arranged 3 days prior, and which gave me, I will admit, a satisfaction I was not entirely proud of and did not entirely regret. Julian would find out about the locks when he got home. He could call me if he had questions. He had my number. Patricia called me Wednesday morning at 8:15. I've arranged for a formal retrieval of the remaining documents from the property, she said. I'd like to be present. So would you, I think. Julian will be there, I asked. Almost certainly. He hasn't left the house since you changed the locks. A pause. He called my office yesterday afternoon. I didn't take the call, but my paralegal noted that he sounded her word bewildered. Bewildered. I turned that word over in my mind for a moment. It was accurate in a way that hurt more than anger would have. I'll be there at 9, I said. Patricia was waiting on the front steps when I arrived, her leather folder under one arm, her reading glasses already on. She was wearing a dark blazer and the expression of a woman who has walked into difficult rooms before and found them manageable. I unlocked the door with my new key. We went in. Julian was in the kitchen. He heard us come in and appeared in the doorway, in jeans and a t-shirt, unshaven, with the specific look of a man who has not been sleeping well. The gray tinge around the eyes, the tight set of the jaw. He looked at Patricia first, then at me. "Dad," he said. His voice came out rough, stripped of the comfortable ease it usually carried. "We need to talk." "We do," I said. "But first there's something I need to take care of. Come with me if you want." I walked to the study. Julian followed. Patricia followed Julian. The safe was built into the back wall of the closet behind a panel I'd installed myself when we moved in. A standard fire-rated safe, nothing dramatic, the kind of thing you buy because you've spent 35 years learning that documents matter and paper burns. I dialed the combination, felt the tumblers turn under my fingers the way they always had, and pulled the door open. Inside the property, deed to the Brownstone in a manila folder. 3 investment account statements. My original business incorporation documents from Callaway Freight, kept for sentimental reasons more than practical ones. Margaret's medical power of attorney. My updated will, a copy the original was, with Patricia. And one small white envelope tucked against the left wall of the safe that I had put there 4 months ago and not touched since. I took out the document folders and handed them to Patricia. She received them without comment and placed them in her leather folder with the efficiency of someone who has done this before and intends to do it correctly. Then I picked up the small white envelope. I turned to Julian. He was standing just inside the doorway of the closet, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw working the way it did when he was trying to hold something in. His eyes went to the envelope in my hand. "What's that?" he asked. "Something your mother asked me to put in here," I said. "About 4 months before her accident." I held it out to him. He unfolded his arms slowly, the way a man moves when he's not sure whether what's coming is good or bad and has run out of energy to brace for either. He took the envelope, opened it. Inside was a single sheet of Margaret's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper she'd had printed years ago, with her name at the top in small navy letters, which she used for thank-you notes and letters she considered important. The handwriting was hers, unhurried and clear. It read, "Edward, whatever happens with this house, whatever the children decide, whatever any of it looks like from the outside, this house is ours. You built it. I chose it. Don't let anyone take that from us. Love, M." Dated 3 weeks before she fell on the staircase. Julian stood in the doorway of that closet and read his mother's handwriting. Then he read it again. His throat moved. His eyes went very bright and very wet at the outer corners, and he pressed his lips together so hard they went white. Then something in his face simply gave. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way a wall gives when the thing behind it has been pressing long enough. His chin dropped. His shoulders fell forward. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something short and broken that started in his chest and didn't make it all the way out. He stepped back out of the closet doorway and walked down the hall toward the living room. His footsteps were heavy and uneven, like a man navigating a floor he suddenly wasn't sure would hold him. Patricia looked at me. I shook my head slightly. She nodded, and neither of us followed him. We stood in the quiet of my study for a moment. Through the walls, I could hear Julian in the living room, not words, just the sound of someone breathing very carefully through something difficult. Are we finished here?" Patricia asked, her voice low. "Yes," I said. "We're finished here." We let ourselves out through the front door. I locked it behind us. The Brooklyn morning was warm and smelled like fresh asphalt from the repaving crew working on the next block. I stood on my front steps for a moment and thought about Margaret writing that note. About her sittings at the desk in the old house in Haddonfield, with her cream stationery and her navy pen, writing the things she wanted me to know in case she wasn't around to say it later. Putting it in an envelope and asking me to put it somewhere safe. She had known. Even then, even before the accident, she had known that something was coming, and she had wanted me to have something solid to hold on to when it arrived. My chest ached with a love for that woman that had no adequate container. I put on my hat and walked down the steps to the sidewalk. The call came to Patricia's office on a Thursday morning, 8 days after we'd retrieved the documents. She called me right after, while I was having breakfast at the counter of my temporary apartment on Classen Avenue, a furnished one-bedroom I'd taken for the month, clean and quiet, and belonging entirely to me, which after 2.5 years was a sensation I hadn't realized I'd missed until I had it back. "Heidi." "Julian retained an attorney," Patricia said. "A man named Douglas Frick out of Park Slope. He called this morning asking to review the property documentation." I set my coffee down. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd be happy to provide whatever documentation he required." I could hear the small, precise satisfaction in her voice. "I also told him that the property deed is solely in your name, that there are no co-ownership agreements, no partnership documents, no trust arrangements involving any of your children, and no record of any financial contribution by any family member toward the purchase or maintenance of the property." "How did he respond?" "He asked if there was anything at all in their names." Patricia paused. "I told him a guest bedroom, which they are being asked to vacate." I picked my coffee back up. Outside the window of my apartment, a woman was walking a very large dog that appeared to be walking her, instead, pulling her steadily down Classen Avenue with the focused determination of an animal that knows where it wants to go. "What about the undue influence question?" I asked. Patricia had flagged this in our first meeting, the legal theory that a will or property transfer can be challenged if someone pressured the owner into it. "Sir Douglas Frick mentioned it," Patricia said. I explained the relevant law. In New York, undue influence as a legal claim requires demonstrating that the person making the decision lacked independent judgment, that they were coerced, manipulated, or mentally incapacitated at the time. A brief pause. "You are 70 years old in full possession of your faculties, and you made every decision in this matter with full legal counsel over the course of 11 weeks. There is no case. Frick's own client told him he'd signed for a legal notice and chosen not to act on it. That's not undue influence. That's a man making a choice and living with it. Did Frick say anything else?" "He thanked me for my time," Patricia said, and he sounded like a man who had just realized he was being paid to confirm what he already suspected. I finished my breakfast. I was rinsing my bowl when my phone rang again, a different number, one I recognized, but hadn't heard from in several weeks. Diane. Her voice when I picked up was wrecked in the specific way of someone who has been crying on and off for days and has run out of the energy to hide it. "Dad." A breath. Can I see you in person? I need to tell you something, and I can't do it on the phone. We met that afternoon at a coffee shop on Vanderbilt Avenue, a small place with mismatched chairs and good light that Diane had suggested, which told me she'd been spending time in this neighborhood and probably not under circumstances she was proud of. She was already there when I arrived, both hands around a mug, her coat still on despite the warmth inside. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She looked like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that she'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. "Dad," she said when I sat across from her. Her voice broke on the single syllable. She pressed her lips together, hard, blinked twice, and then pushed through it with what I recognized as her mother's particular brand of determination. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." "Okay." "Okay," I said. "Renata told us," Diane said. 3 days before everything. She sat Sophie and me down and told us what was going to happen. That she and Julian were going to tell you that the house needed a different situation, that you'd be asked to make arrangements. Her jaw tightened. She said it like it was already done, like it had already been decided. My hands were very still on the table. "And," I said, "and we didn't say anything." Diane's eyes filled. "We didn't warn you. We didn't call you. We sat there and we didn't say a word because Renata said it would all work out and that you'd be more comfortable somewhere else and we." She stopped, swallowed. When she continued, her voice had dropped to just above a whisper. "We wanted things to stay easy, Dad. We didn't want conflict. And that was cowardly. And I have hated myself for it every single day since." I looked at my daughter across the table, this woman I had watched borrow against her own potential her entire life, who had never once until this moment looked me in the eye and said a hard thing about herself. "We didn't say yes," she said, "but we didn't say no, and I know that's worse." "It is worse," I said. Not unkindly, just honestly. Diane flinched slightly the way people flinch when they've braced for something, and it arrives exactly where they expected it. I know," she said quietly. "I know it is." Sophie called 40 minutes later while I was walking back to my apartment through Fort Greene Park. Her version of the same confession was shorter and more ragged, delivered in a voice tight with the effort of not crying and failing partway through. She said less than Diane had, but what she said landed just as hard. "I should have called you Dad. The second Renata sat us down, I should have called you." "Yes," I said. "You should have." A long pause, then very quietly, "Are you going to be okay?" I walked through the park with the phone at my ear, watching a man throw a frisbee to his dog in the long afternoon light. "I'm already okay, Sophie," I said. "The question is what you're going to do next." She didn't have an answer for that yet, but the fact that she'd called, that both of them had called, was something. It was not nothing. Julian still hadn't called. I noted that. I didn't chase it. Patricia sent me the information on a Tuesday morning, in a brief email with no subject line. The way she communicated things she considered factual rather than emotional. Frank and Sylvia Draper had signed a 12-month lease on a studio apartment at 417 Grand Street in Williamsburg. Monthly rent, utilities not included. I read the address twice. 417 Grand Street was less than 3 blocks from the parking lot where I had eaten pheasant with Dorothy Patterson on the night I slept in my car. It sat at the base of the Williamsburg Bridge, not under it, not literally, but close enough that you could hear the subway cars crossing overhead and see the bridge cables from the kitchen window if you stood at the right angle. I sat with that for a long moment. Renata had stood in my front hall 3 weeks ago and told me I belonged under a bridge. And now her parents were signing a lease at the foot of one. I did not feel triumphant about it. I want to be honest about that. Frank and Sylvia Draper were two people in their 70s who had sold their house in Parsippany because their daughter had told them a villa was waiting, and now they were in a studio apartment with subway noise and no parking because their daughter had been wrong and their son-in-law had been too passive to stop any of it. That was not a satisfying outcome. That was just collateral damage, and collateral damage has a weight to it regardless of who caused it. I asked Patricia to send them a letter, not from me directly, but through her office with the contact information for a housing assistance organization in Williamsburg that helped seniors navigate the rental market. Professional neutral, no editorial comment. She asked if I wanted to include a personal note. I thought about it for a moment. Then add one line. No hard feelings. That's all. Patricia sent the letter that afternoon. 3 days later, Renata called. I was in the kitchen of my apartment on Classen Avenue making eggs when my phone lit up with her name. I turned the burner down and picked up. "See, Mr. Calloway." Her voice was different from any version of it I'd heard before. Not the brisk efficiency she used when she wanted something, not the light social warmth she deployed at dinner parties, not the flat shock from the morning of the envelope. This was something else. Careful, measured. The voice of a person who has rehearsed what they're about to say and is monitoring themselves in real time. "Renata," I said, "I want to start by saying that I understand if you don't want to have this conversation." A pause. "But I think there may be a way to resolve this that works for everyone. Julian and I have been talking, and we believe that if we could sit down together, all of us, maybe with a mediator, we could come to an arrangement that—" "Renata," I said. She stopped. "Tell Julian to call me himself," I said. "If he wants to have a conversation, I'm available, but I'm not going to negotiate through you." A silence on the line. Not the silence of someone absorbing a blow, but the silence of someone recalculating. I had known Renata for 8 years, and I recognized the distinction. "Julian is—" she started. "I know what Julian is," I said. "He's the same thing he's always been. And you and I both know that if he wanted to call me, he would have called me by now." I kept my voice level without heat. "Tell him I'm here. Tell him the door is open, but I won't be negotiated with by proxy. That's not how this works." Another silence. Then quietly, "I understand." She hung up. Julian did not call that day, or the next, or the 5 days after that. I noted it each morning, the way you note weather. Not with surprise, just with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who has finally learned to see his son clearly and has made his peace with what he sees. 29 days had passed since I walked out of my front door. Tomorrow was day 30. I sat at the kitchen counter of my apartment that evening and thought about the brownstone, the restored windows, the brass numbers, the window boxes Margaret had planted with petunias in the spring. I thought about Margaret sitting in her chair by the window in the months before all of this began, watching the street below with her reading glasses and her tea patient in the way that only someone who has been waiting a very long time for something to resolve itself can be patient. I thought about what she had written on that cream stationery. "This house is ours. Tomorrow it would be ours again." I called Patricia at 8 o'clock. "Tomorrow," I said. "I'll be there at 9, she said. "I've already confirmed the civil standby." "Good," I said. I went to bed at 10 and slept without interruption until 6 in the morning, which, given everything, felt like its own kind of answer. 30 days. That's how long it took. Before I walk you through what happened when those 30 days were up, comment the house below. Because I want to know who's still here for the part that changed my life completely. Parts of this story include fictional elements for educational and entertainment purposes. If you'd rather not continue, this is a natural place to stop, but the ending is one I think you'll carry with you. Patricia arrived at 8:55 on a Thursday morning in August, 5 minutes early, the way she always was, for things that mattered. A deputy from the Kings County Sheriff's Office pulled up 2 minutes after that in an unmarked sedan, a standard civil standby, which in New York means a law enforcement officer agrees to be present during a property dispute, to keep the peace, not to enforce anything, just to stand there in a uniform and remind everyone in the room that the law exists and has already been consulted. Patricia had filed the request 10 days prior as a precaution. Not because she expected violence, because she expected denial, and denial in a confined space with multiple parties can become its own kind of problem. I was already on the front steps when they arrived. I'd been there since 8:30, sitting on the top step with my coffee the way I used to sit before any of this, began watching Brooklyn wake up. "Good morning," Patricia said, coming up the walk. "Good morning," I said. I finished the last of my coffee and unlocked the door. We went in. The deputy, a compact man in his 40s named Officer Reyes, who had the manner of someone who has seen a great many domestic situations and found them all approximately equally unremarkable, positioned himself near the dining room doorway and took out his phone and began reading something which I appreciated. He was there to be visible, not to perform. The house had the particular smell of other people's lives. Someone's shampoo, the ghost of last night's dinner. Connor's particular brand of 6-year-old chaos that I had come to identify as graham crackers and poster paint. It hit me harder than I expected. Julian appeared at the top of the stairs at 9:15. He came down slowly, one hand on the railing, and stopped 3 steps from the bottom when he saw Officer Reyes by the dining room door. His face went very still. "Dad," he said. "What is this?" "This is the 30th day," I said. "Patricia's here to assist with the transition. Officer Reyes is here as a courtesy standby. It's a standard procedure, nothing more." Julian looked at Patricia. He looked at the deputy. Then he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was very young. Not anger, not calculation. Just the raw, unguarded look of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked straight down the middle on the single syllable. "I need you to know that I—" He stopped. His jaw worked. His eyes went bright and wet. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I need you to know that I'm—" "Julian," I said, not unkindly. "Today is not the day for that conversation. Today is a practical day. When you're ready to have the real conversation, you know where to find me." He pressed his lips together, nodded once, sharp and tight. The rest of the morning moved with the strange, subdued efficiency of a thing that has already been decided. Renata brought boxes down from upstairs without looking at me. Diane and Sophie made 3 trips each to a rented minivan parked outside, both of them, red-eyed, both of them saying nothing to me directly, but making sure I saw them, which I understood as its own kind of communication. Connor came down last, dragging a backpack that was clearly too heavy for him, stuffed with Lego sets he'd refused to let anyone else carry. He dropped it at the bottom of the stairs and ran at me full speed and wrapped both arms around my waist and buried his face in my shirt and held on for a long time. I put both arms around him and held on right back. "Are you coming to visit?" he asked into my shirt. "Every chance I get," I said. "That's a promise." He let go, picked up his backpack, trudged toward the door with the put-upon gravity of a 6-year-old carrying something important. Julian was the last one out. He paused in the doorway, my doorway. The door I'd chosen, the brass hardware I'd installed myself, and turned back to look at me. He opened his mouth, closed it, nodded once. I nodded back. He walked out. The door stayed open behind him. I stood in my front hall alone for a moment. Patricia was in the dining room gathering her folder. Officer Reyes was quietly letting himself out through the kitchen. The house was completely and entirely silent, in a way it hadn't been in 2.5 years. I went upstairs. Margaret was in the bedroom, sitting upright against the pillows. Her hands folded in her lap, waiting the way she had learned to wait through 35 years of delayed flights and late nights, and a husband who was always somewhere else. "It's done," I said. Her face did something complicated and beautiful. She held out both hands. I sat down on the edge of the bed and took them, and she pulled me toward her, and I put my forehead against hers, the way I had on our wedding day, when the justice of the peace told me I could kiss my bride, and I'd been too overwhelmed to move for a full 3 seconds. "It's ours again," she said softly against my forehead. "It's ours again," I said. We sat like that for a long time, the two of us in the house we had built our life around, in the quiet that we had earned. The knock came at 7:15 that evening. I heard it from the kitchen, where I was making Margaret a plate of scrambled eggs, her request which told me she was feeling like herself again, because scrambled eggs with too much butter and black pepper was what she always wanted when something difficult had resolved itself. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and went to the front door. James Wheeler was standing on my front steps with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Atlantic Avenue, the one we'd been going to since it opened 11 years ago, when the owner, a man named Pete, had given us our first cups on the house because he said he needed to know if anybody would actually stop in. We had stopped in. We had kept stopping in. James was holding both cups in one hand and had his other hand in his jacket pocket, and he was wearing the expression he'd had since 1985, the one that said he already understood the situation and was going to let you arrive at it yourself. "I heard it went well," he said. "It went exactly as planned," I said. He held out one of the cups. I took it. We looked at each other for a moment, 40 years of friendship compressed into about 3 seconds of eye contact, and then I stepped back from the door. "Come in," I said. We sat on the front stoop, rather than inside. It was a warm August evening, the kind of evening Brooklyn does well when the heat has pulled back, just enough that the air feels like something you'd choose rather than endure. The street was quiet. A couple walked past with a dog. A kid on a bicycle ran the stop sign at the corner, the way kids on bicycles have been running that stop sign since before I owned this house. James sipped his coffee. I sipped mine. "You okay?" he asked. I thought about it the way I'd promised myself I would, honestly, without the reflex toward reassurance that had gotten me into so much trouble over the years. "Ask me again in a year," I said. He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." We sat with that for a while. The couple with the dog came back the other way. The kid on the bicycle reappeared from a different direction, which meant he'd gone around the block, which meant he was having a very good evening. "Tell me the part you haven't told anyone yet," James said. I looked at him sideways. "What makes you think there is one?" "There's always one," he said. "You've been running logistics for 35 years. You always hold something back until the operation is complete." I turned my coffee cup in my hands. The cardboard sleeve had Pete's logo on it, a small anchor, which had seemed whimsical when he chose it, and now seemed oddly appropriate. "The night I slept in the car," I said. "In the parking lot by the bridge." I paused. I wasn't holding it together as well as I've made it sound. I sat there for 4 hours, and I went through every version of this where I'd done something different, where I'd said something earlier, where I'd been the kind of father who, I stopped, started again. where I'd been better at it all the way back, and there were a lot of those versions. James watched the street. "You know what I kept coming back to," I said. "What?" "The handrail." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the one that arrived whenever I thought about that Tuesday in October. I saw it was loose 2 weeks before she fell. I told myself I'd get to it, and I didn't get to it. I turned the coffee cup again. I've been a man who tells himself he'll get to things his whole life, James. The handrail. The conversation with Julian I should have had when he was 25. The dinner I should have left early about 800 times to get home to Margaret. I exhaled slowly. The car that night was just a very quiet place to sit with all of that. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You fixed it." "Fixed what? The handrail? Everything after." He gestured at the house behind us. "You saw something was wrong and eventually you fixed it. It took longer than it should have. But you fixed it." I thought about that. "Margaret said something to me once," I said. "Years ago when Julian was young. She said, 'Edward, the most expensive thing in the world is not doing something you know you should do.'" I thought she was talking about business. "She wasn't," James said. "No," I agreed. "She wasn't." We sat until 8:30 when James stood up and gathered both empty cups and looked at me the way he had for 40 years, directly without performance. "You did the right thing," he said. "Not just the legal thing, the right thing." "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think I did the only thing I had left to do. Whether it was right, I'll need more time on that." He nodded. That was the correct answer, and we both knew it. "Call me," he said, "when you have more time on it." He walked down the steps to the sidewalk, dropped the cups in the recycling bin at the curb the way he always did. James was constitutionally incapable of littering and walked toward the Atlantic Avenue stop without looking back. I sat on the steps alone for another few minutes. The street had gone quieter. The lights in the houses across from mine were warm and domestic, the kind of light that means people are home and the evening is ordinary. I looked up at the front of my brownstone. The restored windows. The window boxes still blooming despite everything because petunias don't follow human drama. The brass numbers above the door that I had polished myself every spring since we moved in. I built this, I thought. Not as a boast, just as a fact. It was still standing. I went inside and brought Margaret her eggs. I signed the updated will on a Monday morning in September, 11 days after the house was quiet again. Patricia's office felt different that morning, or maybe I was different in it. The first time I'd sat across her desk, I hadn't been able to answer the simplest question she'd asked me. That morning, I sat down, read every page she put in front of me, and signed where she indicated, without hesitation. The document was straightforward in the way that important things often are, once you've done the work of deciding them. The entirety of my estate, the Brownstone, the investment accounts. The remaining proceeds from the sale of Callaway Freight would pass into a trust administered by Patricia's firm. The beneficiaries were Connor and any future grandchildren directly. Julian, Diane, and Sophie were not named. There was a provision any of the three could petition the trust for a distribution after 10 years, contingent on demonstrated financial independence and a written review by the trustee. Not a punishment, a condition. The difference matters. "Are you certain?" Patricia asked the same question she always asked when something was final. "I'm certain," I said. "It's the first time in their lives they won't have a floor I put there. That's not cruelty. That's just reality. The thing I kept them from for 40 years. She nodded and countersigned as witness. 11 minutes start to finish. Diane called that same afternoon. She had a job interview the next morning, an administrative coordinator position, at a nonprofit in Fort Greene that worked with at-risk youth. She had found it herself, applied herself, and had been asked back for a second interview. "I'm terrified," she told me, her voice both raw and alive in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. "I haven't interviewed for anything in Goddad I don't even know how long." "That feeling means it matters to you," I said. "Use it." "What if I'm not good enough?" she asked. The question was genuine, stripped of the practiced casualness she usually used to keep vulnerability at a safe distance. It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in a decade. "Then you won't get this one," I said. "And you'll apply for the next one." "That's how it works, Diane. That's always how it works. You just never had to find that out before." She was quiet for a moment. Then very softly, "I know, Dad. She got the job." She called me the next evening, her voice cracking with relief and something brighter underneath it, the specific brightness of a person who has done something by themselves for the first time and felt the ground hold. Sophie found part-time work at a bakery in Prospect Heights that she'd started going to every morning when she couldn't sleep. She'd started talking to the owner, a woman named Carol, who made exceptionally good sourdough and had, according to Sophie, zero tolerance for people who didn't pull their weight. Carol had offered her weekend shifts. Sophie had said yes before she finished asking. "She's kind of terrifying," Sophie told me on the phone, laughing. "I love her." "Good," I said. "Find more people like that." Julian did not call in September. He did not call in October. In November, I received a brief text, not a call, a text which was still Julian, still the path of least resistance, that said, "Connor wants to know if you're coming for Thanksgiving. We'd like that too, if you're willing." I thought about it for 2 days. Then I texted back, "I'll bring the pie." It was not a reconciliation. It was a Thursday afternoon at Julian and Renata's rental in Carroll Gardens, a 2-bedroom they were paying for themselves, which I noted without comment, with Connor running between rooms, and Margaret sitting in the good chair by the window, and Julian and I talking carefully around the edges of everything that had happened. Like two men navigating a room where the furniture has been rearranged, and neither of them wants to be the one to knock something over. It was awkward and imperfect and completely necessary. Renata made turkey. I brought an apple pie from the bakery on Smith Street that Connor declared was the best pie he'd ever eaten, which was the highest possible review from a person of his age and standards. After dinner, while Renata and Margaret were talking in the kitchen and Connor was demolishing a Lego set on the living room floor, Julian sat down next to me on the couch and looked at his hands for a moment. "I'm not going to ask you to undo any of it," he said. "I want you to know that." "Good," I said. "Because I wouldn't." He nodded. His jaw worked briefly the old tell. "I'm working," he said. "Real work. For someone else." It's... He paused. "It's harder than I thought it would be." "Yes," I said. "It is. I should have found that out a long time ago." I looked at my son sitting on his own couch, in his own rental apartment, paying his own bills for the first time in his adult life, saying a true thing about himself without anyone prompting him. "Yes," I said. "You should have. But you found it out now. That's something." He looked over at me. Something in his face not fully resolved, not anywhere near it, but something shifted. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." Connor looked up from his Lego set. "Grandpa," he announced with the authority of someone who has decided a topic is settled, "you should come every Thursday." Julian and I both looked at him. Then we looked at each other. For the first time in a very long time, we laughed at the same thing. It was a Tuesday morning in late January. The kind of January morning that Brooklyn does without apology, raw and gray and cold enough that the wind off the harbor cuts straight through whatever you're wearing and reminds you that this city was built by people who had no interest in being comfortable. I was sitting in the wingback chair by the fireplace with my coffee, the same chair I'd sat in every morning before any of this began, back where it belonged in the center of the room. Margaret was in the kitchen. I could hear her moving around in there, the particular rhythm of her morning. The coffee maker, the refrigerator, the sound of her cane on the tile when she crossed to the window. The way she did every morning to see what kind of day it was going to be. The sounds of a house that belonged to us. My phone rang at 8:47. I looked at the screen. Julian, not a text. Not a message through Renata. Not a relay through Connor asking if Grandpa wanted to come for dinner. A phone call from my son on a Tuesday morning in January, which meant he had picked up the phone and dialed my number on purpose and was waiting on the other end for me to answer. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up. "Julian," I said. "Dad." His voice was different. Not the comfortable, unhurried voice from the dining room that night in March. Not the cracked, stripped voice from the morning of day 30. Something in between, steadier than either, but without the ease that used to come from never having had to hold anything up himself. The voice of a man who had been carrying his own weight for 6 months and was still figuring out how it was supposed to feel. "How are you?" I asked. A pause. I heard him exhale. "I'm okay, Dad. I'm actually okay." Another pause, shorter. "That's kind of why I'm calling." I turned the coffee cup in my hands and waited. "I've been trying to figure out what I wanted to say to you for about 3 months, he said. Every time I thought I had it, it sounded wrong. Too much like an excuse, or too much like I was asking for something. He stopped. "I'm not asking for anything. I want you to know that going in." "I know," I said. "I think I finally get it." His voice tightened slightly on the last word, the way a voice tightens when it's carrying something heavier than the words themselves. "Not just the house, not just the money, all of it. You were serious, Dad, about everything. You were always serious, and I filed it under things that would get sorted. The way everything always got sorted." I sat with that for a moment. The fire had been going since 6:30, and the room was warm, and the January light was coming through my restored windows at the low winter angle that turned the hardwood floors the color of honey. "You got a letter, Julian," I said. "A certified letter, with my attorney's name on it." "I know," he said. "And you signed for it." "I know." His voice dropped. "I signed for it, and I put it in the kitchen drawer, and I told myself you were being emotional, that I'd come talk to you, and it would get sorted out." A breath. "I never came." "No," I said. "You didn't." A silence that had weight to it, not the comfortable silence of two people who don't need to speak, but the specific silence of a man sitting inside a truth he has been avoiding for a long time and has finally stopped moving away from. "I'm working," Julian said. "At a freight brokerage in Red Hook, entry level. It's not what I pictured." He stopped. "I'm not good at it yet." "Are you trying?" I asked. "Every day," he said. And something in his voice on those two words, something tired and genuine and without performance, told me it was true. It's harder than I thought anything would be. Everything is harder. Paying the Con Ed bill, the grocery runs. Renata and I tracking everything on a spreadsheet like... He stopped, made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Like regular people." "You are regular people," I said. "You always were." I just kept you from finding that out." A long pause. "I know," he said quietly. "I think I knew that somewhere. I just didn't want to look at it." Margaret appeared in the doorway of the living room, her cane in one hand, and her coffee mug in the other, her reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked at me on the phone and read my face the way she had been reading my face for 40 years. Her eyes went soft. She pointed at the phone with her mug mouthed one word. "Julian." I nodded. She pressed her lips together in an expression that held about 6 different things at once. Grief and relief and love, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has watched a family navigate itself toward something better, and has been patient long enough to see it arrive. Then she turned and went quietly back to the kitchen. "How's Mom?" Julian asked. "She's good," I said. "She's in the kitchen. She just walked by. Tell her." He stopped, his voice roughened at the edges. "Tell her I'm sorry. For all of it. Tell her I know she knew what was happening the whole time, and I'm sorry she had to watch it." "Tell her yourself," I said, not harshly, just as a fact. "Call her. She'd like to hear from you." "Okay," he said. "I will." A pause. "Dad." "Julian." "Sione, thank you." The words came out stripped of everything extra, no qualification, no softening, no setup. Just 2 words carrying their full weight. For not buying me out of this one." My chest tightened in the specific way it had been tightening and releasing for months now. The way it did whenever something important arrived without warning and demanded to be felt. "It's the most fathering I've ever done," I said. "I should have started 30 years ago." He made the almost laugh sound again. It sounded more like him this time. The real him, the one I'd caught glimpses of over the years, the one that had always been in there under the ease and the expectation and the comfortable assumption that the floor would hold. "Connor wants to know if you're coming Saturday," he said. "Tell him yes," I said. "Tell him I'll bring the good bagels." "He's going to hold you to that." "I know," I said. "I'm counting on it." We said goodbye. I set the phone down on the side table next to my coffee. Outside, the January wind moved through the bare trees on my street and rattled the window boxes empty, now waiting for spring, the way things wait when they know something is coming. Margaret called from the kitchen. "Was that Julian?" "Yes," I called back. And I looked at the fire. I looked at the room, my fireplace, my restored windows, the floors I'd chosen. The walls I'd had repainted the color Margaret wanted the house I had built my life around, and had been for a while in danger of losing not to anyone else, but to my own inability to want anything specific enough to hold on to. "It's a start," I said. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. I heard her set her mug down on the counter, and then the small, familiar sound of her moving back toward the window to see what kind of day it was going to be. I picked up my coffee. I leaned back in my chair. Outside, through the tall windows of my Brownstone Brooklyn, was doing what Brooklyn always does, moving loud and cold, and entirely indifferent to any one person's story, full of people carrying things and figuring things out and getting on with it. I watched it for a while. Then I got up to make us both breakfast. People ask me sometimes whether I regret how long it took. Whether I wish I'd done it sooner, said something harder, drawn the line earlier. And the honest answer is yes. I do. I spent 40 years building a floor for people who never learned to stand on their own. I called it love. Margaret called it a cage. She was right, and I was wrong, and it cost all of us more than it should have. If there's one thing this whole experience taught me, it's this. A man who doesn't know what he wants is just furniture. He gets moved around the room by whoever's decorating. Don't be furniture. Don't wait until you're 70 years old standing in a dark kitchen before you decide what you actually want from the rest of your life. I made that mistake so you don't have to. I also believe, and I say this as a man who has had a lot of quiet mornings to sit with it, that God doesn't give us difficult families to break us. He gives them to us to show us who we are when everything gets stripped away. What's left when the comfort is gone, that's the real thing. This is what I think family revenge stories and grandpa stories and revenge stories like mine come down to. It was never about the house. It was about the moment I finally decided I was worth fighting for. If any part of this story sat with you, if you've ever felt like a guest in your own life, drop a comment below and tell me about it. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more stories coming, and I promise they are worth your time. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. One more thing before you go. The stories on this channel explore real human experiences, and some upcoming stories contain fictional elements created purely for the purpose of reflection and education. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for, no hard feelings at all, step away and find what serves you better. But if you're staying, I'm glad you're here. I'll see you in the next one.